Thanks very much. Oh, it's nice to be here. Thank you for all for coming. My brief for this talk was very brief. Mark said, I'll say something about animals. I'm quite good at that, so here I go. I suspect one of the reasons why he asked me was that he thought probably most people here would be botanists or plant inclined. And of course, the whole thing about Banksia woodlands is that they're biodiverse from a plant point of view, but they're also important from an animal point of view. So there's some pretty pictures, there you go. I do take photos of flowers, but what I'm really here for are the animals. And that is a bardic Echolopsis curta eating a moaning frog and a bit of bushfire in the background. But what about the animals? This is a biodiversity hotspot in the southwest, Banksia woodlands, we're recognised for all that sort of stuff. There are animals, and as we had some previous speakers, the animals are important. They pollinate the plants and stuff like that. And here's some plants being eaten by animals here, which you can look at later. So what was I going to say about the fauna of a region that spreads from Busselton to up towards Dongara, Geraldton? It's going to be very quick for each section. Invertebrates. Whoa, okay. There's probably way more invertebrate species in Banksia woodlands than there are plants. There could be tens of thousands of invertebrate species. When invertebrate people collect specimens, they come back with lists of, there's 20 species in this family or in this suborder. They hardly ever get down to species. Imagine if you as a botanist went to a site and came back to your boss and said, there's 15 Proteaceae, 20 Fabaceae, and some of those orchids too. That's as good as you could get. That's what invertebrate people have to deal with. But there's lots of them. This is a piece of Eucalyptus todtiana. It's got galls of at least 2 insect species on it, which probably live only on todtiana. The eucalyptus, that's all I could grab on the driveway on the way out this morning. That's been chewed by at least 2 sorts of caterpillars. Bit of fluttergum. Fluttergum's always been chewed by stuff. If I manage to grab a Banksia, there are stuff that eats Banksias as well. So lots of species of invertebrates on the plants, and often species specific. A friend of mine working on small wasps reckoned there was a different species of small wasp on every couple of sand dunes doing the same sort of thing. So massive invertebrate abundance, but very hard to talk about. So I'm going to talk about things I know more about, which are things with backbones. So in response to Mark's request, I thought I'd give a quick review of the sort of assemblage characteristics of that vertebrate assemblage in Banksia woodlands. If I get time, I'd like to talk about some of the other things about fire, mining, feral species, and persistence in urban landscapes, because there are lessons on those points which reflect what that assemblage, how that assemblage sort of is structured. Frogs. Obvious place to start. When people think about frogs, they don't really think of them as being woodland animals at all. They think of them as being fringe dwellers. They breed in a swamp. They might sneak up into the woodland every now and then. In reality, we've got 7 Banksia woodland frog species that are dependent on the Banksia woodlands. 6 of them breed in wetlands, but as froglets metamorphs to adults, they live in terrestrial landscapes, and they're active all year round. You can go head torching in Banksia woodland north of Perth in January after a hot day and find moaning frogs out feeding. They're bloated with water, they come up out of the ground, they feed and they go back down again. They're terrestrial animals. They move kilometres from wetlands outside the breeding season, and there's some evidence of that they're literally migrating. By migration, I mean true migration. Point A, non-breeding season, point B, where they breed, back to point A after they bred. True migration backwards and forwards for a lifespan of 15 plus years. We have one monitoring site, which Ray Frond, who's gone, I think, would be familiar with, where our moaning frogs last bred in 2005. Hasn't flooded since then. They go back each year and call. They were calling again last week. They're probably not going to breed again, but the youngest frogs there are 15 years old. So, lots of frog species. They are truly terrestrial beasts. Then there's turtle frogs, which is a very cool animal. Luckily, Nikki Mitchell isn't here. She's done a lot of work on these guys. It's a frog without tadpoles. It actually lays quite large eggs. The tadpole stays inside the egg, swims around in circles in a very small egg, a very small pool, if you like, metamorphoses and emerges as a whole frog. Very curious beast. The one, where's the light thing? That one there, that's a female full of eggs. They're not very big. They dig forwards rather than backwards. They feed underground, and I suspect that the reason they breed terrestrially is that because they feed underground and move forward and can't hop, they simply can't migrate to wetlands to breed, so they've had to evolve this terrestrial breeding. So there's a whole link between their breeding cycle and the way they forage. And they're not specialist termite eaters at all. They actually eat anything small enough to get into their mouths. That myth was started by someone who cut up 3 turtle frogs that he'd found in a termite mound, and funnily enough, they were full of termites. Reptiles, which I admit is my particular interest. We're sitting on the edge of one of the world's biodiversity hotspots for reptiles. People go on and on about the Great Victoria Desert or the Northwest Cape region. This is about the same. Brad and Marion reckon there were over 60 reptile species just between Moore River and Hill River. At a single site where I've worked at a couple of sites, obviously, in this region, my site near Gingin, a site north of Cataby, 35 plus reptile species in an area of about a square kilometre. So that is up there with the best of the best in world terms. And a very high level of endemism. There's a lot of species that occur pretty much nowhere else except in the sandplain woodlands. And a massive variety, just some of the features of these reptiles. You've got arboreal species. I guess the message in this slide is whatever taxonomic group you're looking at, there's pretty much an arboreal couple of species, there are terrestrial ones, there are fossorial ones. So a huge range of morphology across taxonomic groups, and all the major reptile families of Australia are there, except for crocodiles. And I love this little joker here, the tiny burrowing skink. It's got hardly any legs and it swims through loose sand, and there's a slightly larger burrowing snake that chases it. And the pygopodes, or legless lizards, they're an Australian endemic family of reptile, oddly enough allied to the geckos, and the sandplain woodlands north of Perth in particular are the hotspot just for that family. There's 6 or 7 species, depends on whose taxonomy you follow, and they range from arboreal species like Plephylax, that's that weird beast up there. It basks in the tops of Adenanthos bushes, and as you approach it, it sort of springs like a bouncy stick from one Adenanthos to another. And then there's terrestrial species and, again, fossorial burrowing species just in that one family and just in the woodlands. Skinks, again, big range from big old bobtails to little tiny legless burrowing skinks with those snakes that chase them. A huge range and a number of species endemic to our region. We even have one skink called the Perth lined larista, which is more or less confined to south of the Swan River, with a couple of populations down towards Busselton, but in sandplain country. Bit of some real data. Coolgeloo is a site where I've worked at for a long time for Tronox, who are a sand mining company, and I had the opportunity to do some sampling to calculate absolute densities of reptiles. Most reptile work, you either run around jumping on things when you see them, or you set pitfall traps or funnel traps. Here we were able to sample 10 metre by 10 metre quadrats. There was a mine about to come through, so I had students destroy those quadrats looking for all the lizards. And we did a lot of quadrats and came up with a density of 430 individual reptiles per hectare based on that sampling. So every time a hectare of Banksia woodland gets cleared, that's how many lizards die. And individual species, I don't expect you to... Actually there'll be a test afterwards. How many Larista prepeditor per hectare? 100 of those little tiny legless skinks, about 10 bobtails to Tilica rugosa per hectare based on that sampling. Massive densities of reptiles. Keep on moving. So the birds of Banksia woodlands are also quite interesting. Well, it's all interesting to me. A lot of them are nectarivores, nectar feeders, as you'd expect. They rely on nectar-bearing things like Banksias to feed. Very few insectivores, and in terms of abundance, if you go into a patch of Banksia woodland, do a bird census systematically, you'll come up with 10 honey eaters for every one insectivore. That's sort of proportion. That's a crested bellbird with a cool hairstyle and a western spinebill as a nectar-feeding species. Insectivorous birds really are uncommon. They tend to be sedentary, and we suspect, as it says there, that their abundance is determined by the lowest period of availability of insects in that landscape. And we don't have large numbers of migratory insectivores, which is quite in contrast to, especially Europe and North America and even Eastern Australia a bit. Nectar-feeding birds, okay, they're most of the birds in Banksia woodland. They exploit a temporarily available resource. When the Banksias flower, it's go guys, let's go and feed. They're highly mobile. Things like brown honeyeaters, wattlebirds, tawny crowned honeyeaters, they're moving tens if not hundreds of kilometres over the southwest in the course of a year. They're sort of migratory and sort of nomadic. They've got to be like that because these flowering events are unpredictable as well as being predictable. By that I mean in one year the Banksia menziesii might flower fantastically at one site. They go there winter and feed up and breed. Next year, there might have been a fire, might have been poor rainfall the previous winter, much less flowering, they'll go somewhere else. So they have to be sort of semi-nomadic in their movements. Then there's things like Carnaby's black cockatoo, which is migratory, a granivore, but also a part-time insectivore, which is a clear migration from Banksia woodlands in autumn, winter, to breeding sites in spring and summer. Mammals. Mammals are... Don't read all the words. The message is a whole lot of them are extinct. There's lots of them. Yeah? There could have been over 30 species in a Banksia woodland site north of Perth a century ago. Now you'd be fighting to get 20, probably 15. And half of those are bats. Don't get me wrong, bats are nice, but the terrestrial mammal fauna has been really hammered. The cool one, I guess, that everyone talks about is a honey possum because it's a nectar feeding specialist. It's only in the southwest. It's only in areas of high plant diversity. It's at risk from loss of... Someone mentioned about if you lose the plants, do you lose the animals? Yes. Very simply. If you lose Banksias, you lose honey possums. The Mammal Assemblies draws from a broad range of groups. It's got a couple of specialists or endemics like the honey possum. Some of the small carnivorous marsupials are associated with the sandplain country only. But one of the things that intrigues me about the mammal assemblage isn't so much a feature of the assemblage itself as what happens to that assemblage. And it's what I sometimes refer to as the Perth black hole. And some of the deep water people who did the sampling for a lot of fauna species in the Gnangara area a few years ago will be familiar with this. If you go north of Gingin, you can get the nudgie, which is a native rodent. You can get at least 2 species of small dasyurian marsupial. You can get honey possums. You can get 4, maybe 5 small mammals very quickly. You go 10 kilometres in vastly intact Banksia woodland just north of Gnangara, you might get honey possum. That'll be it. All the other small mammals have gone within tens of kilometres of Perth, and we could speculate why. It's just it's a mystery. The graph there, just to show that I'm not just a zoologist, I got my team to count Banksia flowers because I was interested in using Banksia flowers as a measure of ecosystem productivity. And we know that the honeyeaters, the honey possum rely on nectar. And as you can probably see, some years there's lots of flowers of the Banksia trees, and some years there are 8. It relates to the rainfall of the previous winter because Banksias obviously take a bit of a while to get the idea of producing flowers, and the honey possums and the honeyeaters track that abundance, but they're a bit delayed. It takes a few months for honey possums to breed. The honeyeaters react more quickly. But that's the sort of environment these animals are living in, a highly variable from year to year environment driven by rainfall. And then, of course, you've all got things like fire, which affects the flowering. Banksias don't flower well. And that's good. I got to the point where I thought I can stop here. I've reviewed the assemblage, and the rest is added bonus that I haven't got time for. But fire's an issue. Sand mining is an issue. Red line control areas, numbers of reptiles caught in rehab areas after 5 or 6 years. Rehab's working for reptiles. Feral species are bad news. They're all photographs of cats. Wonder why that is. And please read the fine print.
Bringing land to life.
Thank you. Bringing land to life. That's what urban landscapes are about. Right.